The Ortona Crossroads, Italy, December 1943. The dust of the Italian ruin hung suspended in the air, choking and gray. Inside the hull of the German Panzer IV, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and impending violence. The tank commander, Oberleutnant Müller, peered through his periscope, scanning the shattered windows of the Canadian-held farmhouse ahead. He wasn't worried about the American bazooka. If an American fired a bazooka, there was a telltale whoosh, a massive backblast of flame and dust that shouted, "Here I am! Kill me!" It gave his machine gunners a point of origin to spray with instant death. Müller signaled his driver to advance. The tracks groaned. Suddenly, there was no flash. There was no smoke trail. There was no sound of a rocket motor igniting. There was just a dull, metallic thud, like a heavy book dropped on a carpet, followed instantly by the catastrophic screech of metal tearing apart. The Panzer IV didn't just explode, it was gutted by a jet of molten copper moving at hypersonic speeds. The crew never saw who killed them. From the second floor of the farmhouse, a dusty Canadian private named Mac lowered a strange, ugly metal tube that looked more like a piece of industrial plumbing than a weapon. There was no fire behind him, no smoke to give away his position. He simply redocked the massive spring, loaded another bomb, and waited. This was the PIAT, or Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. To the Allied troops, it was a heavy, bruising, difficult piece of junk. But to the German panzers facing the Canadian Army, it was a silent ghost, a weapon they hated with a visceral passion because you couldn't kill what you couldn't see. The ugly duckling of the arsenal. To the American GI holding his sleek, battery-operated bazooka, the British-designed PIAT looked ridiculous. It was a 32-pound steel tube with a massive trigger guard and a tray at the front. It didn't look high-tech. It looked like something scavenged from a scrapyard. But looks were deceiving. While the American bazooka and the German Panzerschreck relied on rocket technology, the PIAT was a spigot mortar. It used a massive, powerful steel spring, essentially a gigantic version of a pinball machine plunger. When the trigger was pulled, the spring drove a heavy steel rod, the spigot, into the tail of the bomb, detonating a propellant cartridge. This design quirk is exactly what made it the perfect weapon for the Canadian shock troops and the ultimate nightmare for the Germans. Why the Germans hated it. The ghost factor. The hatred German tankers felt for the PIAT wasn't born out of respect for its engineering, but out of fear of its stealth. 1. The lack of signature. In the brutal hedgerow fighting of Normandy or the urban claustrophobia of Italian villages like Ortona, being seen meant dying. When a German Panzerschreck fired, it created a massive cloud of toxic smoke and a flash visible for hundreds of yards. The shooter had to relocate immediately. The PIAT, however, produced almost no muzzle flash and very little smoke. A Canadian soldier could hide in a bush, fire a round, and remain completely camouflaged. German tank commanders would frantically traverse their turrets looking for the smoke trail that wasn't there, only to be hit by a second round. The indoor killer. This was the tactical advantage that broke the Wehrmacht's back in urban combat. The backblast of a bazooka or Panzerschreck was so intense that firing it from inside a room would kill the operator and anyone standing behind him. The PIAT had zero backblast. Canadian troops, particularly known for their aggressive street fighting tactics, utilized this ruthlessly. They would hide deep inside shattered living rooms or cellars, waiting for a Tiger or Panther tank to rumble past. They could fire point blank from inside the building, striking the tank's thinner side armor. The German infantry supporting the tanks couldn't suppress the fire because they couldn't figure out which window the death was coming from. The Canadian aggression. While the weapon was British, it was the Canadians who turned it into a legend of terror. The Canadian Army in World War II developed a reputation for being the shock troops of the British Empire. They were often tasked with the hardest objectives, and they embraced the PIAT's quirks. The PIAT had a nasty recoil. It bruised shoulders, and, if held incorrectly, could break a collarbone. Cocking the spring required immense physical strength. You had to lie on your back and pull with your whole body. It was a weapon for brawlers. The Germans quickly learned that Canadians didn't just use the PIAT for tanks. They used it as pocket artillery. In the Hochwald Forest, German infantry in bunkers felt safe from small arms. But the Canadians realized the PIAT could be used as a high-angle mortar. They would lob 3-ton bombs over obstacles, dropping high explosives directly into open trenches or through the roofs of bunkers. To the German grenadiers, it seemed like the Canadians had magical artillery support that could follow them anywhere. The legend of Smoky Smith. If the German hatred of the PIAT needed a face, it would be that of Private Ernest Smoky Smith of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. October 1944, the Savio River, Italy. Smoky's platoon was overrun by German Panther tanks and self-propelled guns. The situation was hopeless. Infantry against armor usually has only one outcome. But Smith had a PIAT. As a Panther tank bore down on him, its machine guns churning the mud around his feet, Smith didn't run. He stood his ground in a ditch. He waited until the 45-ton monster was just 30 feet away, a distance so close it was suicidal. He fired. The PIAT bomb slammed into the Panther, disabling it instantly. 10 German infantry attacked him. Smith grabbed his Thompson submachine gun and fought them off, then picked up another PIAT bomb. He reloaded, a feat of adrenaline-fueled strength, and waited for the next tank. He held the road. The Germans threw everything they had at him, but they couldn't dislodge the mad Canadian with the spring-loaded pipe. For the Germans, it was demoralizing. A multi-million Reichsmark war machine destroyed by a man with a $50 metal tube. The shaped charge, physics versus armor. The final reason the Germans loathed the PIAT was the damage it inflicted. It used a high-explosive anti-tank warhead. When the bomb hit a German tank, it didn't just bang. It focused the explosion into a narrow jet of superplastic metal capable of punching through 4 inches of steel. Inside the tank, the result was horrific. The jet would spray molten metal around the interior, igniting ammunition and fuel. Survivors of PIAT attacks often spoke of the terrifying sound of the impact, not a boom, but a cracking sound, followed by the cabin turning into an inferno. Conclusion: the triumph of the spring gun. By 1945, the war was ending. The Americans had improved their bazookas, and the Germans had developed the Panzerfaust. But the PIAT remained in service with the Canadians until the very end. The Germans hated it because it didn't play by the rules. It didn't announce itself. It struck from the shadows, from inside bedrooms, and from behind hedgerows without a whisper. For the American audience looking back at history, the PIAT serves as a reminder. Superior technology isn't always about rockets and electronics. Sometimes It's about a heavy spring, a determined Canadian, and the element of surprise. The Wehrmacht mocked it as a toy until they heard that dull, metallic thud, the last sound many of them ever heard. The Street of Dead Men, the PIAT in Little Stalingrad.
Ortona, Italy, Christmas, 1943. If you want to understand why the German Fallschirmjäger, elite paratroopers, truly hated the Canadian infantry, you have to look at the Battle of Ortona. The Germans had turned this ancient seaside town into a fortress. They blew up buildings to block streets, creating killing zones. They placed machine guns in cellars and snipers in attics. Their strategy was simple: force the Canadians into the streets where they could be mown down. But the Canadians refused to play by German rules. Instead, they brought the PIAT inside the house. The problem: the death trap. The German paratroopers were the best defensive fighters in the war. They knew that standard anti-tank weapons, like the American bazooka or their own Panzerschreck, had a fatal flaw: backblast. If you fired a bazooka from inside a small Italian bedroom, the blast of flame out the back would bounce off the rear wall and incinerate the user. Therefore, anti-tank teams had to expose themselves in windows or step out into the street to fire. The German strategy relied on this. They waited for the Allies to show themselves. The solution: mouse-holing with the spring gun. The Canadians developed a brutal tactic called mouse-holing. The idea was terrifyingly simple: never go outside. To get from house A to house B, you didn't use the front door. You blasted a hole through the living room wall into the neighbor's kitchen. While engineers often used pickaxes or demolition charges, the PIAT became the skeleton key for immediate heavy breaching. The scenario: imagine a squad of the loyal Edmonton Regiment clearing a house. They can hear the Germans in the next room, setting up an MG-42 machine gun to cover the hallway. If the Canadians open the door, they die. In any other army, they would have to retreat or call for a tank, which couldn't fit in the narrow streets. Instead, a Canadian private drags his 32-pound PIAT into the hallway. He lies on his back, cocks the massive spring with a grunt of exertion, and aims the spigot at the interior wall, separating them from the Germans. The impact: thud, crack. The PIAT bomb smashes through the brick wall. Because it is a shaped charge, it blasts a fist-size hole through the masonry and sprays the room beyond with high-velocity shrapnel and blast overpressure. The lack of backblast means the Canadian gunner is shaken by the noise, but alive. The Germans on the other side of the wall, however, are stunned, wounded, or killed by the concussion in the enclosed space. Before the dust settles, the Canadians toss grenades through the new hole and storm the room. The German perspective: they are everywhere. For the German paratroopers, this was a psychological nightmare. They had fortified the streets, they had locked down the intersections, but the Canadians were moving like ghosts, walking through walls, gutting the town from the inside out. A captured German officer's diary from Ortona revealed the frustration. The Canadians do not fight like men. They do not come out to meet us. They fight like rats, scurrying through the walls. We set up a strong point, and they simply blow the floor out from under us. The PIAT versus the sniper. Ortona was a sniper's paradise. German snipers hid deep inside crumbled ruins, firing through tiny murder holes. Hitting them with a rifle was impossible. Hitting them with artillery would destroy the whole block and friendly troops. The PIAT became the Canadians' counter-sniper rifle. Because the PIAT could be fired at high angles, like a mortar, a Canadian soldier could crouch behind a garden wall, estimate the distance to a second-story window where a sniper was hiding, and lob a bomb in a high arc. The bomb would crash through the roof or sail through the window. The resulting explosion didn't need to hit the sniper directly. The blast wave in the confined room would neutralize the threat instantly. The Christmas dinner surprise. The fighting was so close quarters that in one instance, German officers were sitting down to a Christmas Eve dinner on the ground floor of a large palazzo. They believed they were safe. Their guards were watching the street. They didn't realize that a Canadian PIAT team had already mouse-holed their way into the building next door. The Canadians didn't bother knocking. They used the PIAT to blast through the adjoining wall. The dinner was interrupted not by a knock on the door, but by the wall disintegrating. The ensuing firefight was brutal, short, and decisively Canadian. Why this matters? The Battle of Ortona proved that the PIAT was more than just a bad anti-tank weapon. It was a siege engine. The Germans hated it because it nullified their greatest advantage, tactical positioning. It didn't matter if a German machine gunner had the perfect angle on the door, because the Canadians weren't going to use the door. They were going to make their own door, using a spring-loaded pipe and 3 pounds of high explosive. The endgame: track killers versus the King Tiger. The Rhineland, Germany, winter 1944-1945. By the winter of 1944, the Germans had unleashed their ultimate armored terror, the Panzerkampfwagen V Hoch auch Ost, better known as the King Tiger, or Königstiger. It was a fortress on tracks. Its massive 88mm gun could destroy Allied tanks from 2 miles away, and its frontal armor was a staggering 180mm thick and perfectly sloped. The King Tiger was designed to be invincible. The PIAT, by contrast, was theoretically obsolete. Its shaped charge warhead could penetrate only about 100mm of RHA, rolled homogeneous armor, under ideal conditions. A Canadian private with a PIAT hitting the King Tiger's front plate was like throwing a tennis ball at a battleship. Yet Canadian infantry still found a way to stop them. The paradox: M-kill versus K-kill. The German crews understood the technical specifications. They knew the PIAT could not achieve a K-kill, a catastrophic kill, a turret.
But the Canadians had changed their objective. Facing the King Tiger, the goal was not K-kill. The goal was M-kill, mobility kill. A 70-ton King Tiger might be impervious to frontal attack, but if it couldn't move, it was just a massive, static gun platform and a prime target for Allied artillery or fighter bombers that dominated the skies. The PIAT's new target doctrine. 1. The tracks. The PIAT bomb's shaped charge was perfectly capable of blowing apart the steel tracks, the drive sprockets, or the delicate road wheel suspension. A King Tiger with a broken track was immobilized and often abandoned by its crew. 2. The turret ring. Hitting the small gap where the turret meets the hull could jam the traversing mechanism, rendering the powerful gun useless. 3. The engine deck. The top armor over the massive engine compartment was much thinner, sometimes only 40mm. If the PIAT could be fired from an elevated position, a bridge, a second-story ruin, or a hill, it could strike this weak spot, causing the engine to burst into flames. Silence and discipline, the last advantage. The King Tiger's crew relied on its armor to protect them while they searched for the visible smoke trails of enemy rockets. This reliance became their fatal flaw against the Canadian PIAT teams. In the final offensives into Germany, Canadian PIAT crews exhibited extreme discipline. They would allow the King Tiger to rumble past, letting their supporting infantry screen move forward. They were betting on the tank crew's overconfidence. The moment the massive tank began to traverse its cannon to engage another target, it would briefly expose its side armor, which was only 80 millimeters, vulnerable, or more importantly, its tracks and rear deck. The Canadian PIAT gunner, positioned in a cellar or a ditch, would fire the silent shot, aiming low. The resulting impact would create a massive, localized detonation on the track housing. The tank would stop dead. German commanders often radioed that they had been hit by a mine or a large shell, because they had not seen the telltale sign of an infantry anti-tank weapon. Why the hatred endured? The PIAT became the ultimate equalizer. The Germans poured immense resources into engineering the King Tiger, a machine that required sophisticated manufacturing and vast amounts of steel. The Canadians countered it with an inexpensive, crude, silent tube that could be fired by one man in a ditch. The hatred wasn't just physical, it was ideological. The Wehrmacht prided itself on massive, powerful, and visible displays of engineering superiority, blitzkrieg. The PIAT represented the cunning, persistent, and unglamorous nature of the Commonwealth infantry, fighting dirty, fighting close, and winning by exploiting the unarmored weak points. The Canadian use of the PIAT, from the house-to-house hell of Ortona to the track-destroying ambush of the King Tiger, cemented the PIAT's legacy. It was a brutal, physically demanding weapon that terrorized the most heavily armored enemy forces, not through technical superiority, but through tactical audacity. This concludes the detailed historical narrative of the Canadian PIAT and its impact on the German forces.